Good evening and welcome. I'm delighted to see so many people joining us this evening. This is wonderful. My name is Deborah Sears, and I had the honor of being the director of Leon County's public library system. Best job ever, let me tell you. I want to thank you all for joining us for tonight's program as part of the annual Festival of Freedom, as well as part of our library lecture series. The lecture series is built upon our library's vision of inspiring a love of reading and a life of learning, and that's what we're all about. I am indebted to the Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. Thank you so much for hosting us. What a beautiful venue. I think they appreciate hearing from all of us. Generally, this particular lecture is held outside of our main library. For many years, it's been at our Dr. B.L. Perry branch, but we are delighted to be here tonight, so thank you so much for hosting us. Tonight, we are going to be hearing about the African American Ascension, the rise of the black middle class, 1865 to 1935. Dr. Nashid Madyun, our presenter, grew up in a small historic town in Arkansas, and the town has a rich cross-section of important historical periods: Civil War, African American leadership during Reconstruction, and gospel and blues music heritage. So it should come as no surprise that Dr. Madyun is a student of history. He earned a bachelor's degree in history at Mississippi Valley State University and then went on for a master's in history at Delta State University. His interests and ambitions didn't stop there, however. When you do history, you do a lot of writing. So he also earned a Master in Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Southern New Hampshire University and later earned a doctorate in management. Dr. Madyun has served as the director of the Stax Museum of American Soul Music, the Texas State History Museum. He's been president and general manager of the Gibson Retail Group. I'm personally very interested in learning about that. The Art Museum and Archives of Hampton University, and now he serves as director of the Carrie Meek and James Eaton Sr. Southeastern Regional Black Archives Research Center and Museum here at FAMU. He continues to teach courses in a wide range of subjects: humanities, African American art, U.S. history, and also graduate courses in business. And in addition, Dr. Madyun has served on a host of boards and public service commissions. We're honored to have him with us this evening for the Library Lecture Series, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Nashid Madyun.
All right, thank you for coming. Should be an interesting topic discuss. It's going to represent a confluence of different paradigms, right? So I have some prepared remarks. I've been told not to move too far away from the podium, so I'm a mover. So you'll see me kind of navigate my way back, but because I come across a point and then I want to elaborate on it, right? So I should add that. So I move, but I do have some remarks. So if you can imagine a situation where you have a culminating set of circumstances, and they all occur just after the Civil War, right? African Americans in the military. You have the poor white class. You have the need for education for a variety of reasons on both sides. The Democrats and the Republicans want to educate this large population of freedmen or enslaved or what have you. There are a lot of reasons for the education piece. Then entrepreneurship, craftsmanship, the fear of that independence. All of that seems to come to a head in that period between 1865 to 1900. But the issue goes back to Columbus, goes up to 1935, especially when you look at Cotton is King, okay? So you have all of those elements that come together including blues music and fine art and African American literature, and that threat of the intellectual capacity of this population that used to be enslaved and work for us for free, right? So you have this rise and these threats. And initially, I started to look at this confluence of conflicts and how to frame that in partnership with the Goodwill Museum. We had a series of photographs and a discussion about how to make agribusiness and plantation experience and their history acceptable or palatable for a broader population. Sometimes when African Americans walk onto a plantation, no matter how historical that is, there's a cringe and goosebumps. But there's history to be gathered from that, right? There's recognition. For a variety of reasons, there are individuals that are being researched now. I think they're going to be uncovered tomorrow about an individual who went from slave to independent businessman. But if you don't step on that plantation, you don't learn about that. So those types of things. So let's get started. After I get finished running my mouth, you'll be able to tour the 13 galleries of this museum, and you'll see the correlations of the talk and why this talk flows the way it does, right? Okay. Under the cover of night, the growing sound of whispers, feet, hooves, and motors stood swollen with a macabre intent. The power they yielded was overwhelming as dozens of middle-aged white men snatched an uncharged, sleeping black man from his bed and retreated to a secluded area in the woods. Cheers of hate, slurs, and laughter from the mob, the judges and the jury, burst above the flames as a rope lifted the black man from the ground by his neck, leaving him to hang and struggle for his last link to the real world, a solid oak tree. This is the image of the Jim Crow South I have when I think of the price the emerging African American middle class paid to live and fulfill their end of the social contract of the United States, while the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan emerged to stifle their inevitable ascension. What we're looking at is the Red Summer of 1919. We're 100 years removed from that time. The lynching and mob violence of the late 19th and early 20th century was so pervasive that W.B. Du Bois of the NAACP's Crisis magazine began chronicling the trend in geography in order to inform the nation about the true horrors of Jim Crow. The Arkansas and Mississippi Delta regions were frequent listings, along with Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, and chronicling the trends and alarming consistency is revealed. In agrarian-based economics of the South, a spike in this dark activity emerged in the fall of the year. Coincidentally, this is the same time that the planters settled with sharecroppers and tenant farmers with no fear that a Negro would contest his arithmetic. So what I'm looking at there is, some of you may be very familiar with the issue just after slavery and the fact that you had to maintain that free labor or something similar to that free labor, right? And debt peonage and paternalism were some of the tools that were used. A phrase called settling time. Settling time with sharecroppers and tenant farmers that have made some type of contract with the planter, the landlord. We rent the land, we rent the tools. I don't have the tools. You don't have the labor if you're the planter. Something needs to happen to maintain this relationship for the largest distribution of wealth around the world, like King Cotton, right, for the United States. We have to maintain that. So at settling time, it's time for us to come to the table, look eye to eye and say, hey, I borrowed money for shoes, sugar, meat, medical supplies, and what have you all year long, but I've also brought in this amount of crops, so there's a balance that's due me, right? So Jim Crow, black codes, and that social environment allowed the planters to say, you still owe me. I said, but my math says you owe me. But if you did that in the wrong type of way, you could die, right? So it was no coincidence. It was no coincidence that the trends of these lynchings were always in the fall, during harvest time, right? Look it up. And there'll be a lot of points that I won't be able to go into that I want you to look up further. But there were no parallel arrests of white men or black men, not arrests, but lynchings was spiked during that time. That's because an arrest wouldn't scare you from asking for your money as much as a lynching would, right? Imagine that. Going to jail, you get out, theoretically, right? You die, you mess up the livelihood of a lot of people. So, the horrors of such violence throughout the year notwithstanding, that consistent spike went on. It was the looming real threat of black ascension, Negro independence, and the return to the lower class of the poor white person. See, in the 1820s to 1850s, there was a class of workers on these plantations. As the African population and that wave came to the United States, there was a class of people who really did not want that to occur. There was a poor white class, North Carolina, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, that worked these lands. Not just cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, definitely in this area, right? And they would negotiate in good faith, good return, and work. They were poor, subsistence, they were able to grow what they could, live off of that. So there was a quiet migration of that class. And in the 1830s and 40s, there was a resentment for this slave, a resentment for a group of people in bondage, right? But you couldn't speak of it. So what happens there? Hate starts and buds and flourishes. Before the Civil War, there was a class of people who were voiceless until later on they had an opportunity with sheets and politics and economic pressure, the KKK, the first wave, or what have you. They came out in a big way. Ascension is an elevation in status, being or consciousness that carries a connotation of permanence. A regression connotes a stall, status of austerity, or reversal of progress. The life of the historically African person has witnessed a duality of regression and ascension in her American history that culminated in a remarkable crossroads at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Historically African, or person of the African diaspora, allows the conversation to encompass those that were trafficked in slavery, all parts of the world. Historically African allows us to review the gaps in heritage and understanding between those that remember Africa, those that were privy to family that lived in Africa before bondage, and those with the glaring discontent of generations with an identity consciousness that begs for a benchmark. And if you're familiar with that piece, there are a great many people who research their families and cannot go past slavery. You have to use tax records, newspapers, deeds of sale, property. Those are probably the full gamut of what some African Americans can do to research their family. And that's just back to the mid-19th century, right? So after selling the Ocean Blue in 1492, you heard that, discovering America but not the gold and metals he sought, Columbus resorted to the human capital resource of the indigenous people of the new land, Tanos. That's Columbus saying. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things. This is from his diary, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know of them. For I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They will make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them in all and make them do whatever we want. Considering the sugarcane industry of Northern Africa and the similarity of the New World climate, considering the failure of its original gold and silver objective and the newfound resource of potential slaves, Columbus believed Taínos, the indigenous people, to be the perfect slaves for this industry. Columbus came over, not to the United States, of course, you know that part of the story, came over and could not find this gold and silver. But he was on the hook financially through loans, Portuguese and Spain, to deliver on that financial debt. And could not deliver on it. But he had this human capital resource, right? So he took it back, took the 500 back, or tried to, 200 died along the way. But he was happy with 300. So starts this slave trade. By 1502, the system had grown to include the Americas, with an estimated 15 million Africans transported by the 1820s. Only 2 million white Europeans relocated across the Atlantic during the same time. And you're going to see that theme of population flip, right? That's important because that becomes economic and political power, which is a threat, right? It should be noted that from 1492 to the mid-1950s, that 60-year period, more than 90% of those Taínos people succumbed to disease. Only 10% remained after this Columbian exchange. So a slave is human property owned for the purposes of uncompensated labor with little or no rights that are traditionally afforded a citizen or of a community or nation. This is a general definition, yet it sums up the reduction of individuality and quest for identity of the American slave, whether it's during the period of British North America, its colonial period, or the more popularized period of the American Revolution. So I'll skip forward a little bit. So from 1820 to 1860, in southern agrarian counties, a swift average of 200% rise in improved land, 450% rise in cotton production, and 60% in general of the populations were enslaved Africans. This duality of economic philosophy grabbed the political landscape as one of its greatest defenders, John C. Calhoun, Vice President of the United States from 1825 to 1832, coined the phrase, the peculiar institution. So the institution is peculiar, not because he supported, and later, one of the reasons Florida A&M was able to come on board is because of the political fear that this massive population could now vote. And if the education is not in our favor, then for the most part, they're going to vote Republican, or God forbid, they vote independently, right? 60% of the population is black in most of these communities, because we just talked about the poor white community fled to get work, right? So John C. Calhoun knew this. Biloxi. Abraham Lincoln. If a slave was purchased today, he would be worth approximately $60,000 to $130,000. Consider the real physical mechanic of the ability to breed, birth, and sell this property. Many of the countries of the world agreed to abandon the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, yet 25% of those Africans subjected to bondage in America, or the Americas, came from 1807 to 1870, after the Civil War. 25%, a quarter of it. Now we're talking about going back to the 1500s. So there was an economic uptick, but a blatant disregard to what's legal and what's not legal in the face of what? Wealth and opportunity. It was about the money. In 1860, at the brink of the Civil War, there were approximately 4 million slaves, totaling 13% of the state's population. That statistic is probably very similar to today, 12% of the population. The total value of the United States currency was less than a seventh of the value of American slaves, right? So we're not going to let these slaves go and bring back this poor white class, and they work, and they're able to sue us and take us to court. They're able to sue us and take us to court, but the slaves can't, right? We're not going to let that go. If one was the owner of the entire livestock population in America, that owner would only have 1/3 of the value of the slave population. If all of the cotton crops were owned by one person, that gentleman would be more than 10 times shy of the value of the American slave. We're talking about the lost cause. 4 million times $800 the average value, that's $3.2 billion in value in the mid-19th century, in 1860. So the politicians knew about this. The big debate as Abraham Lincoln is looking to come into the presidency, he was asked this question over and over again, and what to do with the Negro problem. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes. This is Abraham Lincoln in the Stephen Douglas debate. Nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. That's wild. That's a wow for me, right? So in the interest of time, I'll jump ahead to some more of his stances. In this debate, we start to see that the Civil War historians are probably in the audience. The North was about to lose, came very close to losing, right? The only way we can fix that if we're in the North is to really address that slave issue to where you take it out of the hands of the South. Contraband was an issue, Benjamin Butler. But Abraham Lincoln proposed in the threat that if they become free, they would have voting power. So his first major proposal was, let's allow slavery to continue to 1899. So he could care less about the humanitarian side of it. It was about the money in politics, right? I see some frowns. You should research that. Yeah. So he did have one flip-flop, right? And it really started to usher in this ascension. You have freedom to do what? To buy property, to get an education. But during the Civil War, you had freedmen and enslaved participating in the military, right? So much so that they excelled. Now, the story that was forbidden to be in a lot of the newspapers and circulated was the fact that after the Civil War, there were a lot of black militia contracting themselves out, continuing to practice, become very good at arms, to the point where if a Republican was going into a southern state to do whatever, he preferred to be protected by black militia and paid them very well. North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, skip to some of the quotes. Texas can boast of colored militia companies whose arms are furnished by the state. These Negro militia companies parade with all the pomp and circumstances of war, and no objection is raised. So thoroughly reconstructed have the people of Texas become. So it was to Texas' benefit to boast of how strong and powerful and how well they executed this black militia. But of course, that was advertisement for the black militia. Virginia, in Arkansas, in Texas, there was philanthropy. See, you have, and we'll get to Tampa here in a second, you have African Americans in the military now, or militia, that are getting paid contract wages. Nice suits. And you know, you have agrarian communities where you have people who, you know, they wear the Sunday best, you know, the poor white class, and you have this big gap. And then you have the white planter class. And you're downtown and you see an African American, well built, right? Because he's working out all the time, carrying a gun or 2 or 3, walking down your streets, going into the store, buying whatever he wants. That was the image that we're dealing with, and well respected. So there were newspaper articles that started to come out to say that the black militias have disbanded. But we have records that show that they continued all over the United States to operate, because that image of powerful black identity was too much for the community to bear at that time, that black independence. In Arkansas, the USCT, or the militia that was there, had this financial independence, saw orphans of the Civil War, orphans of slaves, and started to contribute and help build Southland College, a school for orphans, still to 1925. There were other such schools and orphanages across the southern United States, supported, it was a cause, supported by black militia. They were the ones you go to for money. You knew they had the money, right? As a matter of fact, now we get to Tampa and the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. You had malaria and a variety of diseases and the climate in Cuba, right? That was a huge problem. So Teddy Roosevelt set out across the southern United States to get athletes from Texas and Louisiana that he felt could handle that, 125,000 or so that could handle that. But it was, to make a long story short, the Buffalo Soldiers, who were also contracted, that came in and was documented to save the Rough Riders on 2 specific occasions. Now there's a very notable flip-flop there with Roosevelt. I keep saying flip-flop, but just after Cuban independence, the War for Independence, Teddy Roosevelt had the opportunity to run for governor of New York, right? On this wave of political capital he had gained and amassed, right? We Rough Riders stuck with the 9th Cavalry, and in the first charge on what we call Kettle Hill, they and we went up absolutely intermingled, so that no one could tell whether it was the Rough Riders or the men of the 9th who came forward with the greater courage to offer their lives in the service of their country. That night we took spades and worked at the trenches shoulder to shoulder, white and colored men together. I don't think that any Rough Rider will ever forget the tie that binds us to the 9th and 10th Cavalry. It wasn't because the colored troopers were colored that we admired them. It was because they were brave men, worthy of respect, and now in civil life, it should be the same. That's how he felt. That's on record. That's in one of his speeches in New York. Southern newspapers got a hold of that, beat him up publicly. Politicians beat him up privately. And in the spring of the next year, 1899. They are, of course, peculiarly dependent upon their white officers. None of the white regulars or Rough Riders showed the slightest sign of weakening, but under the strain, the colored infantrymen, who had none of their officers, began to get a little uneasy and to drift to the rear. This I could not allow, as it was depleting my line. So I jumped up and, walking a few yards to the rear, drew my revolver, halted the retreating soldiers, and called out to them. I appreciated their gallantry with which they had fought, and would be sorry to hurt them, but that I should shoot the first man of any pretense whatever. Went to the rear. This ended the trouble. That's just a few months ago, singing the praises, right? But it was the rise of this identity. He was progressive to an extent, right? But political pressure, hey, I guess you could say, now I can't speak for him, but I guess you could say I put it out there and research will show. But it was the Southern sentiment that just could not fathom, could not digest this rise in black identity, right? So, in the meantime, this confluence that I talked about earlier, you have black militarism, you have black land ownership, the voting power. You know, we speak a lot about Reconstruction and Bruce and rebels and my hometown. You have Abraham Miller, individuals that became state legislators and started the National Baptist Convention. All this political movement, Mount Bayou, first all black city in America. You know, we know about that, right? So you have politics, economics, the debate between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and black military. And now we have this independence, because this is the capital that can purchase the music and the art, right? So now you have a full wraparound of a culture. Culture can be defined when you have systems that are consistent and documented. So now you have art and music that's not general. You have art and music that depicts African Americans in a position of compassion and prominence, right? You have musicians that are commanding a full audience on their own, not as the first person up, not as a support individual in the band. World War I occurs. We already know what happened with the Spanish-American War, right? And these individuals who fought in World War I see France and Germany come back, say, we don't have to live like this, right? The sharecropping issue I told you about, the debt peonage and paternalism that was so pervasive across the South, these individuals said, we can come together and we can sue for our right. The issue was, all right, you have, do simple math, you have 100 acres, right? 100 acres, you might have to help me with the math, right? So you have 100 acres, and per acre, keep it simple, $100, right? Okay. So you take that $10,000 or $100,000? $10,000. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. So you take that $10,000, right, and you have your wares that you've subtracted or deducted all year long. You know, we talked about settling time, right? And they say, no, you owe me $1,000. You can't leave. If you leave, anybody sees you, they can kill you on the spot, right? Basically, you're my property. Economic slavery still exists, okay? That's debt peonage, you know, that cycle of debt. And that was pervasive across the South, okay? So in 1919, 1918, 1920, you have some of the issues here in Florida. They said, well, we don't have to deal with that. We can start our own incorporations, set up officers, set our independence. LLCs and corporations. As a matter of fact, they learned that from masonry. That's another story about how to secure the rooms and communicate without other people knowing, right? And still documenting and taking minutes. So they sued, a lot of them began to sue for the right to take that $10,000 and go to the factoring companies. Factoring companies are the middlemen, cotton roll. You know, you have Memphis, Nashville, New Orleans, all the major ports of entry so you can get the cotton or tobacco or cane around the United States. So you have middlemen that buy the cotton and pay you back. Well, 1919 is pivotal because the cost of cotton per pound went from 23 cents to 50 cents. So it's real easy to see that I can go get $20,000. So we just double it, right? We just go to $20,000 and come back and give you $10,000. The issue, the parallel issue with that time is that the South was being cleared. Places like Arkansas and Mississippi, they were looking for workers. The population was still dense, all this land. So if I had my $10,000 free and clear after I paid my landlord, I'm the one who's been working the land. So I can just go buy some of this uncleared land, clear it, because we cleared this land, work it. We don't have any competition because where's the poor white class? They're gone. So we can't have this. So you have instances of people saying there's mob violence. The blacks are rising up against us. So the Red Summer of 1919 is really the story of propaganda versus economics and the rise of this black independence that we cannot have. We need to maintain that. And it worked because another organization also had similar type of rituals. We have a copy in the Black Archives, the Constitution of the KKK, the second wave, and it didn't list Germans and Italians or Chinese. It just listed the need to attack the Negro race and their ascension throughout the bylaws, right? 1920s. So you have the second wave of the KKK. It's no coincidence that you have this second recrafted rise of black identity and independence. These are the children of the individuals who just first started going to college, buying land. The Freedmen's Bureau, and I'll close on this point, we could take some questions. The Freedmen's Bureau, one of two entities enacted by Congress to help these freedmen, set up 19 banks around the United States. One of those banks is Appalachian Calhoun. Black Archives uses it now for African American art. It's a wonderful place. You should go see it. But there were 100,000 accounts by slaves, 10% made here in Tallahassee, right? You can go online and look at some of these records. And I saw it very interesting that you talk about the ignorance and the lack of capacity to think or however of these freedmen, but they were saving money traveling on foot or however from the Carolinas coming to this bank. We had 10% of those 100,000 accounts, and they're depositing money with a mark, an X. That means I know I need to be putting my money there. That's trust, because they know about this opportunity. And with that money that they saved, they started businesses, sent kids to college, and now you have the Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Renaissance, and all the art we've come to love, all the music we come to love, the jazz out of New Orleans. That would not have happened had it not been for that rise. So we'll take some questions. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes, and afterwards we'll have a tour guide here that will take you on a tour. The museum is open to the public generally. You can walk at your own leisure, but for groups we do offer a guided tour, and the tour guide is here. I don't necessarily see him, but otherwise I guess I'll be on the hook. So, but I'll take some questions at this point. Yes.
Doctor, would you address the retaliation after every attempt to ascend, like during the Reconstruction, then the 1920s, the Tulsa incident is an example, and you know, in our time, you would think about the drug intrusion whenever there was progress.
Well, I'll start with the drug infusion. You know, I've had the opportunity to look at that. CIA, political. It's still we don't necessarily have all the quantitative evidence to address that fully, but it's very possible that it was an attempt to keep a class of people subjugated. But the question is going to be why? What was the benefit? But in the 1920s and Reconstruction, we know exactly what the issue was. This political power and economic independence. There's a book called Local People. It looks at the white citizens class. There's a book called American Congo that looks at the KKK and the adverse response to Tulsa and Elaine and even Rosewood here in Florida. And it's all tied to the waves of the Ku Klux Klan, the first and second wave. There were 3 waves. Third, of course, civil rights movement. Reconstruction would be the redeemers and that opportunity to try to bring back white power. As a matter of fact, the Spanish-American War was an opportunity to say white power was here. There's an opportunity. And unfortunately, Roosevelt saw that it was also an opportunity for black independence and an opportunity for blacks and whites to work together. And he spoke to that fact. The consistent response was the KKK. The KKK, the first one was specifically tied to the missing working class, the missing opportunities. Now you have, where in the 1820s and 1830s, the whites could not work because you have a free class. Now you're saying the blacks can now work in jobs that my grandparents could not, and now they're going to get paid. You know, so there's resentment there. Most violence comes from, you know, psychological issues. It's not for us to define. We look at the history and try not set up those dominoes so it repeats. But those 2 instances, 1920s and 1860s and 1880s with Reconstruction, KKK influenced that retaliation.
Repeat the name of those books, please.
So you have, we'll give you a good list. The Mind of the South, it's by Cash. You have American Congo, Nan Elizabeth Woodruff. Most Southern Place on Earth by James Cobb, C-O-B-B. Local People, I can't remember who wrote that, but it's almost a chronicle of how not only the KKK worked, but the KKK without the hoods, the economic pressure. There's a black business there that's printing, taking the money away from this business. And that's the one that stood out for me because my father used to run a newspaper. But we're just going to tell everybody not to go to that business and go back to this business. Or put some economic pressure. If I know your aunt or your uncle works for me, then you fire them or threaten to fire them if you go to this business. And it was pervasive, that type of behavior. So.
Thank you.
I have a question about the same time as the Reconstruction. You had homesteading laws. I know for a fact that we had over 500 homesteaders, because I did some research on that in Florida. Anytime you have that many homesteaders, you know, we have only anecdotal evidence of what happened to them, but land at that time was critical for assets. But you also needed additional capital, which many of the young men mustering out of the Union armies were getting. Not as much as the whites were, but there was sufficient capital to be able to start homesteading. So the issue is, one of the things about being a middle class is that your property rights are going to be honored. And now the thing is, did this happen in Arkansas, in the other countries, other states?
Yes.
Were they homesteaders? And what happened to those homestead rights? My research, I stopped it because I was trying to do it on a computer, and this was on a mainframe. And it was just impossible with punch cards and mainframes. It was the most cumbersome, so I just quit. I mean, 5 years later, SPSS came out and more accessible, but I was working mainframes. And so it's just, but my question was, many of these very successful farmers did not manage to keep their land. And why was that?
Well,
Those would be the backbone of your middle class.
yes, ma'am.
Because when we worked in the movement, the strongest leaders in South Georgia came out of the land. They owned farms. You could always count on them
That's true.
to stand up. So I asked, what happened to homesteading in the rest of the South? Why is that not attributed to the rise or the beginning of a black middle class? Because for whites, that's how the middle class was created.
I'm glad you said the last part. So, see how I can frame this properly, because it's being recorded, right? So, first of all, there's a mechanism with Google put in Google Scholar, right? And a new screen comes up for peer-reviewed articles.
Yeah.
That's a quick way to do it, but it's free, which is free,
Yeah.
right?
Well, that was
And then
40
you put
years
in,
ago, you didn't have Google.
well, but now we do. Now we
Well,
do.
personal computers even.
So,
Yeah.
put in African American land loss. African American land loss. 19th century, African American land loss, 20th century. There's a lot of scholarship that's come out about that. There's also in the Library of Congress, Ida B. Wells. She did a lot of work in chronicling what happened during the Red Summer 1919. You mentioned at the end of your question, power and land go hand in hand, and that's how a lot of white people were able to do it. But during the Jim Crow period, if I put you in jail, as a matter of fact, during that 1919, if I put you in jail, while you're in jail, we go get a lawyer and we scoop up that land, right? And when I get out of jail, I should have the rights, you mentioned rights, to go back and get that land, but I could not go. I could not, either I did not have the money to get the lawyer to fight to get that land back, or there was some, excuse me.
Which I've been reading, and if you guys have read the Color of Law, it's a real interesting book. It's a little past the 1920s and all that stuff, but it starts right when the white flight and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And also Dr. Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks, White Liberals.
Mm-hmm.
He also has a really good chapter of, mainly because they would buy that land, they'd go to, like you said, work that land, but then they would hike up the price constantly until
You couldn't get it back.
Yeah.
So you're right. Land was key to
And
the,
property rights.
well, there's no property rights.
That's what I mean. But the thing is,
No, what I'm saying is,
The ability to be able to hold your land.
you can hold the land as long as you stay on it.
But I'm wondering, what I'm asking is, I know this happened before. What happened in other southern
So
states?
yeah, it was pervasive throughout the South. The land,
Freemen going for homestead rights, 160 acres.
40 acres. That was the other
You can go for
opportunity.
160 acres for a
Wow.
section. I went to.
So, okay, so
what
so we can move on.
Yeah.
Is that the issue is you're definitely right about the opportunity, but during the Jim Crow period that we're talking about, the opportunity was not always afforded the black population, not because it wasn't legally right. It was the obstacles in maintaining that right for fear of threats to your family. The issue, when I mentioned local people, the White Citizens Council, and the KKK, it was not, those mechanisms were in place to strip those rights under a veil. So it's not that the rights were not there, but if I went to, the 160 acres may be available, but if I went through the Freedmen's Bureau for this promise of this 40 acres, which never happened, it was under this mechanism that was established, and at least I could say is approved by the federal government. And so they waited on that, but it never came through. But there were rights afforded, but there were rights stripped, wrongly stripped.
But there was a generation of freeman farmers.
Oh, there was a
And
huge
some of them
generation.
managed to hold on to their lands for
That's true.
generations. Some of them lost it within a short.
Which is unfortunate, yes ma'am.
To answer the question, we had, my grandfather had about 100 acres in Georgia, Georgia, deep south, by a million. And they just took it. White man came on my land and just took it. So they left us with a little farm, got a little half acre now. Yeah, they just took it. It's much good.
So there's gonna be two stories, there, and there's gonna be a lot of families that can say there's two stories. There's a story of how we got that land, right? How they amassed that land, which speaks to the proper rights and middle class that you're talking about. But unfortunately, there's a story on how it was taken. You see, that's the research that needs to be gathered. Is you're stripped of the rights. You have the rights, and you're stripped of the rights some way. So, I think. Okay. Any more questions? Okay.
I heard you say peonage, I heard that, but also paternalism?
Yeah, so debt peonage and paternalism. Paternalism would be a phrase that I know is best for you, like a parent, but you have a class of people that look at another class of people as if, you know, I don't own you, but I can tell you what to do. I know what's best. So it's paternalism. So that paternalism and peonage, debt peonage will go hand in hand to continue to oppress a class economically under the veil of what's right. Right, so, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a very lively group here. The engagement is exactly what we are aiming for with our lecture series. I'm delighted to see all of you participating. We have more opportunities. We have light refreshments. More than welcome to visit with each other. We have a wonderful guided tour. Before I let you all go your merry ways, I'd like to recognize Dr. Larry Robinson, who joined us this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. And this particular facility is a gem, and I do hope that everyone stays and looks around and visits more. So thanks again for coming. Thank you, Dr. Madyun. Enjoy the rest of your evening.